Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you so much for being here. I can see that we have a few people who've started trickling in already, which is wonderful. Thank you to all of you who've made the time and space to attend this webinar live. We are also going to be recording this webinar and then sending a copy to everybody afterwards. We have offered a number of these kinds of webinars to your community already. We've discussed different topics like cyberbullying. During our previous webinar, we talked about sexting as well. So we're really not shying away from addressing some of those really complicated and tricky topics in the realm of parenting in the age of technology. So for the sake of everyone who is joining us live, we do want to give it just perhaps another minute or so to make sure that everybody trickles in. While I'm doing that, I'm going to look through our list of attendees. I can see that we do have Jeff there. So Jeff, I'm going to invite you to unmute if you'd like, and just give us a few words of welcome as we wait for more people to come in.
Thank you, Teodora.
Sure.
And thank you for everyone who is attending live and for anyone who is also watching this recording later. We appreciate uh, Linewize's willingness to be able to put on these webinars as a technology department for the Farmington Municipal Schools. We feel like it is a very important uh, resource for our parents and our community to be able to tackle some of these very perplexing issues that seem to arise with technology. So thank you, Teodora.
Sure. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jeff. All right. So I'm going to share my screen with you in just a second. All right. All right, fantastic. And once again, I can see that we have a few more people who joined us live. Thank you so much. Welcome to yet another community education presentation for all Farmington families. You've probably heard me talk about a few different topics so far. The very first webinar that we offered was a kind of sort of general overview of online safety and digital well-being for young people and how you could really be in a sort of an active participant in that as their parent or caregiver. And then we've offered a whole series of sort of more highly focused webinars on specific topics. Today, we're going to be talking about something we haven't actually delved into yet, and we're going to have a focus on age-appropriate technology use and device ownership today. So I'm really excited about it. It's our first opportunity to really sort of dig a little bit deeper into this topic. For all of you who are joining us live, if you have any questions, any comments or thoughts that sort of pop up as I'm sharing this content with you, please do feel free to use the chat function if you'd like. Towards the end of the session, I will be sharing an email as well that you can also utilize in case you have any questions, in case you would like any additional resources at all. So just a very brief introduction for those of you who might be meeting me for the very first time. My name is Teodora. I'm the Director of Wellbeing at Linewize. And I have a background that's a little bit unusual for someone who works at a technology company. I have a master's degree in clinical psychology. I've also worked as a psychotherapist with adolescents, with parents, with families in general. And for the past sort of decade or so, I've been particularly focused on technology use. Which is why I'm so excited about today's specific topic. So what do we mean when we talk about healthy and balanced technology use? What do we mean when we talk about building some of those healthy boundaries? What's the impact of technology use on children and young people? And what are the best, sort of most effective ways in which their parents and caregivers can be involved? And so what you can expect for today's presentation is a little bit of a mix of some brand new information, brand new content and tips and advice and recommendation. And we're going to do a little bit of a sort of a refresher on some of the topics we've already talked about. So I want to just give you a very brief overview of your district's community digital wellness program first. I then want to give you just a very general lay of the land when it comes to some of the key online safety risks that you need to be aware of and that your children might be coming into contact with. nowadays. And then I want to delve into the focus sort of topic for today, which is age-appropriate technology use and device ownership. So we're going to talk a little bit about what we mean by age appropriateness, why that's so important in the context of technology. We're going to look at some of the legal background to that, some of the sort of psychological, neuroscientific background to that. There'll just be a little bit of geeking out in that area, not too much though, I promise. And then I want to give you, as always, some practical insights and some practical recommendations in terms of some of the questions that you'll want to ask yourself when it comes to your child's technology use, when it comes to their device ownership as well. And then we're going to end by talking about our ABC approach to online safety management, which you might be familiar with already. I'm going to take you through those ABCs and then tell you just a little bit about how you can use the custodial parent app in order to really implement those ABCs. And I'll be sharing a QR code with you there and a URL as well that you can use to create a custodial account for yourself and your child, just in case you haven't done that yet. So an overview of the community program. The program consists of 3 key pillars. And the first one is the Online Safety Hub. If you would have watched our very first presentation on online safety and digital well-being, you would have seen me go into your district's Online Safety Hub, do a little bit of a demo, and kind of show you the different types of content that we have there and the different ways in which you can get your many online safety questions answered there. But it's a really fantastic website that provides you with a lot of support, a lot of resources, a lot of education around some of the hottest topics to do with children's behavior online and your sort of active participation in their digital journeys. The second pillar is the custodial parent app, which we'll get to towards sort of the end of the presentation today. It's a really great parental tool that can provide you some insight into your child's activity on their school-issued device, as well as their personal device as well, to give you that really great holistic view and insight into what they're doing online in the virtual spaces that they frequent. And then third and final, what we're doing right now, it's these parent webinars, these webinars for your whole community that really allow me the opportunity to sort of do a deeper dive into some of these specific topics, and then of course provide you with that opportunity to ask any questions should you have any. And the one final thing that I want to share here as well, just to give a little bit more of a sort of background and perspective on these resources that your district is providing you, is that we are part of a sort of a global team. I'm the US-based online safety and digital well-being expert, but I have counterparts in all the other regions where Linewize operates, for example, the UK, different parts of Europe, and then Australia and New Zealand as well. And so all of the information that you'll see me providing here, all of the resources that we provide you, we come together as that in-house team of experts to give you that kind of global perspective, but still make sure that it's really regionally sort of applicable and relevant to you as you're parenting your kids here in the US. So in case you're not familiar with the hub yet, and perhaps you haven't gone and visited yet, this is the URL. You can also scan this QR code, and that will take you straight into the Online Safety Hub. You'll see there that we have a whole host of different types of content. You'll see that pretty much every topic that I cover today is covered in one way, shape, or form inside the hub. We have text-based content there. We have longer form, shorter form content. Our newer edition is video-based content as well. So you will see my face pop up there in a few different videos that we have talking about some of the key online safety and digital well-being topics there. We have an extensive list of apps, platforms, and games that we have reviewed to give you a really detailed insight into what those games and apps are about, what are some of the age recommendations, which is one of the topics we'll be talking about today, and what are some recommendations for you in terms of what are some of the better and not so great places for your children to spend their time online, but also what are some of the ways in which you can empower yourself and your child to have a more positive and safer experience while they're in these virtual spaces. So before we sort of go into the business of trying to solve these problems and trying to make sure that our children do have a safer and more positive experience online, of course, it's really important that we have some insight into what some of these problems are. The difficult thing with technology, of course, is that it changes so quickly. There are constantly new platforms coming out, new features coming out. AI is probably one of the biggest and sort of key differentiating factors that we've seen over the past, let's say, 12 to 24 months. And so things are always changing, even as we're getting lots of new opportunities and benefits. At the same time, almost parallel to that, we're seeing an increase in these online safety risks and all sort of the different ways in which bad actors can utilize some of these new features of the online world, but some of the ways in which children can sort of take hold of these and use them in some not so positive and not so great and helpful ways. So it's important to know what some of these key risks are so that you can sort of keep an eye out on these, whether your child is 5 at this point, or they're 10, or they're 15. It's still really important for you to have a sort of general sense of what these are. And then again, inside the Online Safety Hub, you'll be able to find a lot more information on some of these different risks. But we're going to move into one sort of specific element of your child's technology use, and that's this question of age appropriateness and their ownership over devices. And I thought we would start by looking into sort of some of the positive trends that we're seeing and some of the negative and more alarming trends as well. One thing is that the levels of awareness for parents and caregivers in particular have definitely increased and improved over the past sort of 5 to 10 years. And so whereas back in 2018, some of the research that was being conducted at the time in the realm of gaming in particular, actually found that an overwhelming majority of parents admitted that they didn't really pay much attention to age limits and age recommendations and age restrictions when it came to allowing their children to play different games. And in fact, what some of this research found was that a lot of parents were actually more comfortable allowing their children to consume and to watch R-rated movies than to actually prevent them from accessing some of the games that were not inappropriate for them. And then when we fast forward to 2023, what we see is that an overwhelming majority of parents actually say that they regularly check some of those recommendations and some of those game rating systems in order to really make a much more informed and conscious and intentional decision around the different types of games that their children are actually going to play. And we are going to have a session specifically dedicated to gaming behaviors a little bit later on this year. So that's where I'll go into sort of the weeds of what are we talking about when we're talking about appropriateness of games even? What are some of the questions that we want to ask ourselves there? And what are some of the ways in which we can really inform ourselves a little bit more about that gaming world so that we don't end up with a very sort of binary black or white, yes or no type of approach to games, but we really have a much more nuanced approach, especially if our child is really, really into games. And there's some really fantastic benefits there that they can get from being in those gaming worlds. Some of the negative use, or rather some of the negative news around technology use comes from some of the research done around device ownership and also around sort of looking at where children are spending most of their time. What are the different spaces in which they're spending most of their time? And we're starting to find that children are owning their own devices, smartphones in particular, at younger and younger ages. Children tend to start owning tablets from a very, very young age. And so often we see about the age of 1, in some cases 1 or 2, that a child will have their own sort of designated tablet. When it comes to smartphones, that age used to be older in the past. So we were talking about sort of 12 or 13. That has gradually gone down. So in 2024, and this is statistics coming from the UK, almost 25% of British children who are aged between the age of 5 and 7, so some of these kids haven't even started school yet, actually own a smartphone. And that's very recent research that just came out in April of 2024. When we look over to our side of the pond, in 2024, almost 70% of Gen Alpha, which is children between the ages of 2 and 12, are watching TikTok solo. So they're watching TikTok completely on their own with no sort of adult around. And then 44% of them are watching YouTube Shorts on their cell phones. And this is, again, that age range of 2 to 12. So you can see there that we have a kind of a mixed bag of things. On the one hand, we do have greater awareness from parents and caregivers when it comes to this question of what are the sort of age appropriate features of a particular, gaming virtual space. But when we're looking at the age at which children are beginning to own a smartphone, remember, this isn't an old school flip phone or sometimes referred to as a dumb phone. This is a smartphone. They are younger and younger, and in some cases, they're as young as 2, 3, 4, or 5. Some research from Australia has shown that a very, very small percentage, granted, so maybe 2% or so of 5-year-olds in Australia own their own smartphone. Again, this is a smartphone, right? It's not a flip phone. It's not a dumb phone. So this question of age appropriateness, as I mentioned earlier in this presentation, has a couple of different implications. And on the one hand, we have this legal implication that is really important to keep in mind. It helps sort of guide and determine the right limits when it comes to children's movements in virtual spaces in what is essentially a limitless virtual world. So we often get this question around, does the internet sort of at large have an age limit or a restriction? And the answer to that is yes. The answer to that is yes in pretty much every country in the world. In the US, we have the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, or COPA. You may have heard it being referenced, especially recently, but in a lot of different sort of media outlets and contexts. There is a more updated version of this that is supposed to be voted into law relatively soon. We need to see how that goes. But this sort of original version, if you will, of COPA was passed by US Congress back in 1998. So yes, it's heavily outdated, but it essentially doesn't allow websites, any virtual space, to collect children's information if they are younger than the age of 13, and if there isn't parental permission there in place. And we can go into, we would need a whole new other sort of webinar to go into the details around how COPA is actually being followed by different virtual platforms. There are a lot of issues there around how exactly we can age verify and identify when a child is a child, when they're a minor, as opposed to age 18 plus. How do we identify that somebody is in fact a parent? How do we actually request for parental permission? So there are all sorts of sort of complications there, but this is the sort of the key law, the guiding principle when it comes to age appropriateness in virtual spaces in the US at least. And then the other piece here is the sort of psychological side of things. So asking that question about age appropriateness when it comes to child's development, their psychological development, their brain development. And the answer to that question of whether our children's brain development can actually dictate their internet readiness, their readiness to own devices, to utilize devices, the answer to that is also yes. And there are a few different sort of types of research that point in this direction, that point in the direction of just how important it is to consider that when we think about our children in these virtual spaces. So there's some relatively recent research coming from Oxford University in the UK that has pointed to these particular periods of what they refer to as heightened sensitivity to the negative impacts of the digital world, looking at social media there in particular. And it looks like for girls, this is sort of between the ages of 11 to 13 when they're particularly sensitive to some of those negative influences that come from these digital spaces, and 14 to 15 for boys, so a little bit older for boys. And then we see this happening again when they're around the age of 19, most likely because there's a very big transition, of course, happening for them in their life at that point, once they're sort of oftentimes leaving home, but certainly moving into sort of a different phase of education, of adulthood, probably moving into college at that point. So that seems to be another really sensitive period when they're a lot more sensitive to some of these sort of negative influences from the internet. We then also have multiple studies from the field of neuroscience, so really looking at the structure and the development and the changes of our brain that have shown that different parts of the adolescent brain develop at very, very different rates. We might have some parts that are even overdeveloped in some instances, while other parts are very much underdeveloped. And I'm sure that many of you by now would have heard this statistic that our frontal lobes, so the sort of the decision-making, the impulse controlling center of our brain, that does a bunch of other things as well. It doesn't actually finish fully developing until we're about the age of 25, which is considered to sort of be the end of adolescence. So this one is perhaps an even more powerful sort of implication than the legal side. The legal side is really something that governments need to worry about, big tech platforms, businesses. For us as the caregivers, as the parents, as the teachers, coaches, counselors, so on, all the trusted adults in a child's life, what we really want to be mindful of is our child's brain development, so their biological age and their maturity level as well. And if you've attended any of the previous webinars that we've hosted for your families, you probably would have seen this slide as well that speaks specifically to brain development, online safety management, and why children sort of encounter some of those online safety risks I shared with you before when they're between that age of around 12 to 15. And this is where that research plays into this again. And we can see here just how important brain development really is. We know that between that age of about 12 to 15, children are at the greatest risk of encountering online safety issues and getting into a little bit of trouble online. And so, of course, we'd want to know why that is. And there are a couple of key reasons there. On the one hand, we do know that, again, talking about device access and ownership, there is a drastically increased amount of access that children have when they're about that age. So for the most part, most children will already own a smartphone, certainly by the age of 15. So that explains it to a certain extent, right? As soon as you have access to a certain space that might be problematic, you're much more likely to encounter some of those problems in those space. So that's a no-brainer, if you will. When we look at the development that's going on and the changes that are going on in a child's brain, we see some answers there as well in terms of why they tend to get entangled in some of these issues online at that age specifically. You would definitely have noticed, especially if you have children around this age, that they have this really heightened desire for autonomy, for independence, for really taking the lead on deciding about their own behavior, deciding around their own schedules, deciding around who they're going to be spending time with, who they're going to be friends with, what classes they're going to be taking, and lots and other things. This desire for autonomy pops up in lots of different places, sometimes in quite surprising ways. But even as this sort of need for independence is strengthening, what we have at the same time is a part of their brain that's very much so underdeveloped. And it's this part that controls impulse control, right? So that ability to make decisions, that ability to say, no, I'll only have, one piece of chocolate and not three. And this applies in so many different scenarios as well. So what you're left with there really is this increase in risky behavior and very much emotionally based decision-making happening there as well. And this reflects in both the online and the offline world. We know that statistics from emergency rooms, for example, show that teenagers and sort of that age range, they are the most likely to get into accidents. And this aspect of their brain development explains that. And so, of course, it's no surprise that we sort of see this translating in the virtual space that they spend so much of their time there. So all of this is to say that having really consistent boundaries in place, which we'll be talking about in just a little bit, and having those rules in place, being really, really consistent, very, very clear with these is incredibly important during this sort of developmental stage of your child's life, because we see that combination of that increased want for independence, decreased, or not a decreased, but a not yet well-developed sort of ability to control their impulses. And we see this exposure and increased access to different devices and different virtual spaces as well. So some of the practical insights that I want to share with you here and some questions that you can ask yourself around your child's tech readiness. These mostly lie in the realms of handling device ownership, so actually owning a smartphone. That tends to be the device in question the most when they get to that age, managing and sort of handling online relationships as well, and then dealing with inappropriate content. And these are sort of the 6 key questions that I would recommend that you ask yourself and that you sort of bring up with your child as well. Number 1 is very sort of a very basic, very fundamental question that I do often hear parents talking about. And this is just a very basic sense of ownership and responsibility for what is an incredibly expensive piece of of tech equipment, a supercomputer, if you will. And this is where we want to ask some questions around, is our child ready for full-on ownership at this point? Or do we really want to consider access before we actually move into full ownership? Question number 2, does your child understand the concept or the difference between private and public? And by this, I mean private versus public in the context of information. So what are the types of information that we do and don't share in public versus in private spaces, whether those are online or offline spaces, and behavior as well. And I'll again be talking about this in the context of boundaries as well. So what are some expected behaviors that we have, again, in private and in public? We talk about this all the time in the offline world. We, again, just want to sort of move that conversation into the virtual space as well. Question number 3 is, how prepared is your child to handle online negativity, so toxic behaviors, peer pressure, say situations with cyberbullying, for example, whether they are the ones who are being cyberbullied or whether they are the ones who are the bystander, and in which case we would expect them to know some of the positive bystander behaviors that they can implement in order to make this a better experience for themselves, but primarily for the person who is the victim or the victims of cyberbullying. Here we're also talking about questions around consent. So is our child aware yet around sort of aware of this topic of giving consent to somebody having access to their information? If somebody asks them for a nude, for example, or if somebody asks them to share a friend's really personal information in that context, do they know how to say no? And do they know what to say as an alternative? So are they aware of these healthy boundaries around essentially the exchange of information that happens online? Question number 4, I spoke to a couple of minutes ago in the context of brain development. So how capable is your child at this point of self-regulating? I also mentioned earlier that one part of this question is focused around their biological age, but a really important contributing factor here too is their maturity level. And sometimes you'll see that those don't quite match up, and this often happens with children, and it's perfectly natural. But they're both things that you want to take into consideration when you're sort of observing your child and thinking about their ability to self-regulate their time, their behavior, and their emotions as well. So how difficult, for example, are transitions for them? If there's going to be a need to stop using that phone after, say, 30 minutes, because now we're going to have to go to soccer practice, or we're going to have to do our homework, or we're going to get together as a family and have dinner, how easy or difficult is that task going to be for them? Question number 5, does your child know how to do some of the more sort of technical aspects of keeping themselves safe online? So do they know how to adjust privacy settings and report problematic or negative or dangerous online incidents on the platforms that they're using? So if your child is really wanting to create an account, say on Instagram, do they know where the privacy settings are on Instagram? Would they know how to change those, how to adjust those? And then if something happens on Instagram, if they encounter inappropriate or adult content, if they witness cyberbullying or they're the victim of cyberbullying, will they know how to navigate the Instagram platform and go and actually report either that piece of content or that user or that comment on that platform? Another really, really important question for you and for your child as well, actually. And then the final question there that I think will be particularly important for all parents and caregivers is your child actually prepared to accept the fact that you are going to be an active participant, an active companion on their digital journey? And what I mean by this is you being a mentor and you being there to supervise, not you being there to act as a kind of surveillance or to be incredibly restrictive and sort of rigid when it comes to their use of technology. I mentioned that very sort of binary approach to online safety, which is just a very simple yes or no. What we find, especially in 2024, given how complex technology has become, how complex our children's behavior around technology has become, that binary approach can be quite difficult and in some cases even sort of detrimental to our kids. So we really want to have a more refined approach where we're really aware enough. We don't need to be as aware as our children are, but aware enough of some of these issues around online safety, digital well-being, reporting incidents, sort of managing those privacy settings so that we can really mentor them. We can be there to serve as a resource, to help them, to encourage them, but also to absolutely supervise and make sure that we have an awareness of what our child is doing on their device. And I'll be talking to you about how you can do that with Custodio in just a second. So I want to move now into a little bit of a sort of a quick refresher on the ABC approach to online safety management. I've mentioned some of these approaches and sort of strategies to you already, but I just want to go through each one more time just to sort of share some of those recommendations with you again. So we're talking here about the access to technology. We're talking about those boundaries around technology, and we're talking about how we can effectively and regularly communicate with our children about technology. And so when we're talking about managing access, we're asking those what and when questions as well. And so some of the key recommendations that we have here, for one, is to use parental control tools, either to block or to manage your child's access. And this can be custodial. This can be some of those sort of built-in or native internet filters and controls. They can be free, they can be paid for, really whatever ends up working best for your family. But it's incredibly important that, again, through the use of these parental control tools, you're there to be that supervisor and to be that mentor and to be that guide and to be that helpful resource as much as possible. Utilizing resources that are provided to you by your school district, like the Online Safety Hub, like this whole digital wellness community program, as a guide specifically for those age recommendations that are incredibly important. I can't possibly overstate just how important they are when it comes to social media and gaming in particular. And so in that review section of your Online Safety Hub, you're going to see a really extensive list of Instagram, TikTok, Roblox, Telegram, X, formerly known as Twitter, Facebook, and there's about 300 different apps and platforms that we reviewed. I wouldn't even be able to list all of their names for you right now. So there's a very, very extensive library there of different platforms. If you haven't visited any part of the Online Safety Hub yet, I would recommend that perhaps be the first one that you go into and that you explore sort of how we structure all of our reviews and how we give you those recommendations for privacy settings, for those age-based recommendations and many others as well. And then, as I mentioned, any of those native inbuilt internet filters that you can activate, those are fantastic. Enabling things like Google Safe Search, like YouTube restricted mode as well, can go a really long way to controlling your child's experience online. Talking about those clear boundaries, I already mentioned how important it is to really make sure that we maintain those sort of throughout our child's sort of development, throughout adolescence. A really great way of doing that is using something called a digital contract or a tech contract. Sometimes they're called family agreements. You'll find templates for these inside your Online Safety Hub. They make it really, really easy for you to establish those clear rules, both around those, what questions, the when questions, the for how, long questions, when are we going to be using tech as a family? When are you allowed to use it solo by yourself? What rooms do we want to be using them in? So many other questions. But these digital contracts just make it really, really easy for you to lay those out and make sure that everybody in the family knows exactly what these rules are for the whole family. And then the really important thing to remember, of course, is as your child is changing and developing and growing, and as their brain is also developing and growing, and as they are slowly building up those skills that I shared with you earlier in terms of self-regulation and self-management and knowing how to keep themselves safe online and knowing how to help others online, you want to then change your digital contract as a family, and you want to let it grow and expand and just sort of give your children a little bit more room to roam around those virtual spaces while still very much being involved, again, as that mentor and as that supervisor. But certainly your relationship to your child in the context of their digital journey will change and transform as your child is changing and transforming as well. You would have heard me talk about this before as well. Anytime I've spoken about sort of screen time limits, bedtime, nighttime is a really, really important time to switch off, especially for your child. And this all goes back to their brain yet again. I always like to say that sleep should be considered sacred. Children need a lot of sleep. The younger they are, the more of it that they need. And it's incredibly important for healthy brain development. We don't understand all the reasons why yet, and we don't understand all the mechanisms, but we know that when we are sleep deprived, certainly when our children are sleep deprived, they're just not able to function well. They're not able to learn well. Their memory centers in their brain don't work well. They're not able to show up in their relationships as well as when they've had enough sleep. It can impact their digestion, a lot of other things as well. So it's very important to identify those really clear off times at night. Typically, the recommendation is about 30 minutes before bedtime. There shouldn't really be any use of sort of highly stimulating screen-based content, and then as much as possible, removing all devices from bedrooms. This is a recommendation, of course, that applies to all of us adults as well, but it's particularly important when it comes to kids. And speaking of rules that apply to us as well, one of the most effective, maybe most difficult approaches here to managing your child's online safety is to modeling the types of behaviors that you want to see. I like to use dinner time as a great example for this. If you do decide that you want a device-free, a screen-free dinner or lunch or whatever it happens to be, maybe the most effective way to get your child to turn off their own device or turn off the notifications on their device is to do that first, and to do a lot more show as opposed to tell is how I like to put it as well. So take out your own device, turn it off, turn off the notifications, either put them in a sort of a common space at home, put them in a different room, whatever you agree on doing as a family. But we find, especially once our kids get into sort of those teenage years, showing them what we want them to do ends up being a lot more effective and efficient than actually telling them what to do and how to do it. And then finally, the C in the ABCs refers to communication, and really making all of these topics around online safety a frequent talking point in your home. For this session, we were talking about age appropriateness, we were talking about device ownership, we were talking about sort of different virtual spaces having different levels of safety, different levels of appropriateness for your kids. That in itself can be a really, really great conversation starter. And I always encourage parents to use these webinars as conversation starters. And even if you've never spoken about online safety in your home before, to say, your district is providing all of us with these webinars. I just saw one. There were a few different sort of questions and things that came up that I realized we never talked about before. What do you think about that? What do you think about the fact that 25% of little kids in the UK own their own smartphone? Do you think that's crazy? Does that make perfect sense to you? Do you think that's safe? Do you think that's dangerous? You could literally pick any one of the many sort of statistics and insights and tips that I've shared with you today and use those as that starting point. Again, even if you've never talked about this in your home before. But doing this really shows that you are sort of actively engaged, you want to participate, you're really curious about your child's digital life, and you really, really, really want to show up for them there. And some of the recommendations that we have there is to use strategies like problem solving. These are especially effective when there's sort of bullying incidents, or not even as bad as bullying, but even if there's a miscommunication, you get a lot of group chats that a lot of kids participate in that they do find very, very stressful, and a lot of drama can come out from those sort of types of spaces, those types of social spaces, if you will. So really showing up there for them, asking them what their ideal sort of resolution would be to that problem, what the ideal situation outcome would be for them, and then asking them how you can help them to really make that a reality. Do you need to help them report something? Do you need to help them adjust privacy settings? Do you need to help them report a particular user? Have they seen content online that is really disturbing that they know just should not be in that virtual space? Say something like Roblox. And do they need some help from you in order to report this, whether to the platform, to the school, to law enforcement, if that's necessary, whoever it might be. But just really signaling to your child in that way that you do know some things. You're not sort of a complete tech dud as so many of us are, and you do understand some of this digital world. Leaving space for them, especially if you've never talked about this topic before. If you ask them some questions around it, you might find that they're a little bit hesitant at first. So having a little bit of that patience with them in that case, and really trying to talk with them as much as possible, as opposed to talking at them, which is, of course, a trap that we do fall into from time to time. So I'd like to wrap up today's session by giving you just a little bit of insight into the Custodio Parent app, into how the app can really contribute to you implementing this ABC approach to online safety management. This is just a sort of quick overview of both that school device-based insight and that personal device-based insight there as well. So a few different things that you can do here, have a little bit of sort of a basic insight into what your child is doing on their school issue device. One of the, I would say, the most sort of desired and asked for features when it comes to both the school issued and personal devices as well has been that pause button, which you will have in both instances to be able to really just kind of, again, create that off time at the end of the school day, once kids are done doing all their homework, everything that they need to do for school, to really make sure that they can focus and that you sort of as a family can come together. And you can do the same for the personal device. And then there's some additional functionality there that you will have for that personal device. Essentially, a great way to think about this is, if you look at libraries, if you look at school districts in the US, because of some of the laws that exist here, they all have to provide an internet filter to make sure that when students are accessing the internet, they're not running into problematic, dangerous, adult, inappropriate, and other types of content. When it comes to a parental control tool like Custodio, you are essentially becoming that filter, or rather this app is becoming that filter, so that you have that ability to essentially do the same thing that the school district does for you during the school day, to be able to do that when you're at home as well. And of course, there are lots of ways in which Custodio makes this very easy for you, automates a lot of this, makes it very intuitive, so that, again, even if you're not particularly tech savvy, you're still going to have a very, very easy time of utilizing this app. So if you haven't installed it yet, if you haven't created an account for yourself yet, it's, again, a very intuitive, very easy process. There's only a couple of steps that are involved there. You can scan this QR code with your phone right now. And that will take you to the landing page where you can put in your email address, and then you will be guided through the rest of that process, which is pretty straightforward. And then if you do have any questions around that process of installing Custodio, utilizing Custodio, if you have any sort of questions around the functionality of the app, please feel free to send an email out to myschool@custodio.com. And we'll get back to you as soon as possible to make sure that we assist you with using all of those really, really fantastic features. That is your school district's website. If you go there, you will see the Online Safety Hub linked over there. If you have any questions about anything else to do with online safety, digital well-being, any questions around device ownership, anything at all, please feel free to just email me directly. And ask me. If the Online Safety Hub has any articles, any resources that might do a good job of answering your question, I'll be sure to let you know and make sure that I can provide you with really any other resource that you might want. So before we wrap up completely for today, Jeff, I'll just invite you to unmute one more time and just to help wrap us up.
Thank you, Teodora. And
Sure.
thank you, everyone who attended this evening. I know it's always a busy time in the evening for everyone, and we certainly appreciate your participation in these webinars. If there are ever any questions regarding Farmington Municipal Schools technology, always feel free to reach out to our department, and we'll be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you again, Teodora.
Absolutely, Jeff. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all of you who attended this live. As I mentioned at the beginning, we did record this session, and so I'll be sharing that with Jeff in the next 24 hours or so, and we'll be posting this up so that you can use this as an ongoing resource. So thank you so much for your time and attention once again, and I look forward to seeing you very soon at our next webinar. Thank you.